I didn't realize my war with the HOA had truly begun until the morning I stepped into my garden and smelled chemicals instead of soil. The sun was barely up, dew still clinging to the leaves, and yet everything looked wrong. Wilted tomatoes, blackened basil, yellowing vines slumped like they'd given up overnight. That's when rage hit me like a punch to the chest, because this wasn't neglect. This was poison. My garden wasn't decoration. It fed my family, grounded my sanity, and kept me connected to the little patch of earth I owned outright. And someone had decided it offended their sense of order. Someone with a clipboard, a smug smile, and too much authority. HOA Karen. She claimed the garden was overgrown with invasive weeds. That's what the notice taped to my fence said. No warning. No conversation. Just a fine and a receipt for approved chemical treatment. As I stood there staring at dying plants, the truth became painfully clear. She'd ordered a contractor to spray my garden while I was at work. I marched to her house, fists clenched, but stopped myself. Yelling would give her what she wanted. Karen thrived on confrontation. On rules without reason. On power. I needed something else. Something smarter. Something that followed the letter of the law while twisting it into a lesson she'd never forget. So I started reading. HOA bylaws. City planting ordinances. Landscaping loopholes. Every late night, every highlighted clause sharpened my resolve. And buried deep in the rules was a beautiful, overlooked truth: the HOA controlled weeds, not plants. And thorny, native vines. Perfectly legal. That's when the idea took root. If she wanted approved landscaping, I'd give her the most compliant, aggressive greenery imaginable. Plants that stayed on my property. Plants that followed sunlight. Plants that didn't poison soil but protected it. Over the next weeks, while my garden struggled to recover, I planted patience. I prepared trellises. I sourced native thorny vines known for rapid growth and impenetrable density. And I waited. I knew patience mattered because retaliation screamed louder than reason, and I wanted reason to win. Every seedling felt like a promise, every tie a vow to stay lawful. Neighbors watched quietly, curious, cautious, uncertain. I smiled, waved, and kept planting, letting time do the arguing. Karen would underestimate silence, paperwork, and plans. That miscalculation would cost her comfort, pride, and peace. When consequences arrived, they would feel organic, unavoidable, and earned, rooted in sunlight, soil, bylaws, and her own choices. Nothing illegal, nothing violent, only growth answering control. And once it started climbing, there would be no stopping it. Karen didn't knock. She never did. She simply appeared at the edge of my driveway 2 days later, sunglasses on, clipboard pressed to her chest like a badge. She surveyed the recovering garden with theatrical disappointment, lips pursed, eyes sharp, already rehearsing authority. I stayed calm, hands in pockets, letting her speak first because people like Karen reveal themselves when given room. She cleared her throat and read aloud from the bylaws, emphasizing words like uniformity and compliance, as if repetition made them sacred. She informed me the chemicals were standard procedure, that the contractor was approved, and that resistance would result in escalating fines. Her tone suggested generosity, not trespass. I asked one question: where was the written warning? She smiled thinly and said warnings weren't required for violations posing community risk. Basil, apparently, endangered civilization. After she left, I documented everything. Photos of burn marks on leaves. Soil samples in labeled bags. Time stamps. Screenshots of bylaws highlighting native plant protections. I emailed the HOA requesting records of authorization. Silence answered. Silence can be instructive. That weekend, neighbors wandered over, offering sympathy and quiet stories of their own run-ins. A rose bush trimmed to death. A tree removed without consent. A patio painted the wrong shade of beige. Karen's pattern was control disguised as order. Listening hardened my resolve. I began rebuilding the garden carefully, starting with cover crops to heal the soil. Clover for nitrogen. Mulch for moisture. While the beds recovered, I focused on borders. The rules allowed hedges, trellises, and native vines within setbacks. They even encouraged them for erosion control. Encouraged. The word glowed on the page. I visited a local nursery and spoke with an old horticulturist who smiled knowingly. He recommended hardy natives with thorns, fast growth, and minimal maintenance. Plants that respected boundaries but asserted presence. I bought enough to line my fence, spacing them precisely, documenting receipts, species names, and planting dates. Compliance, perfected. As weeks passed, green returned. The garden breathed again. The vines reached outward, curious, climbing patiently. Karen drove by often, slowing, staring, calculating. She sensed movement but not direction. I kept tending quietly, watering at dawn, training tendrils toward sunlight, never crossing property lines. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration with teeth, lawful and inevitable, waiting for gravity and growth to finish the conversation. I knew consequences would arrive slowly, disguised as greenery. Rules would bind her hands, neighbors would notice, and comfort would erode. Each morning I measured growth, adjusted ties, and recorded progress. Patience became strategy. When the vines finally touched her walls, shade would turn to scratches, scratches to complaints, and complaints to lessons written in leaves. Time, sunlight, and bylaws would finish what arrogance started, without shouting, trespass, or poison again. The first real sign that Karen was losing control came on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after I planted the vines. I was adjusting a trellis when I heard her heels clicking angrily against the sidewalk, fast and uneven, the sound of someone already upset before the argument even begins. I didn't look up right away. Letting silence speak had become my favorite tactic. She stopped at the fence and cleared her throat loudly, twice. "What is that?" she demanded, gesturing at the vines now stretching confidently along the boundary. They were healthy, green, and unmistakably thorny, their tendrils curling with purpose. "Native erosion control vines," I said calmly. "HOA approved." Her mouth tightened. She flipped pages on her clipboard like the answer might magically appear if she turned fast enough. "Those look aggressive." "Plants grow," I replied. "That's kind of their thing." She snapped back that they were encroaching visually and creating an eyesore. I asked her to show me the bylaw defining visual encroachment. She couldn't. Instead, she warned me she'd look into it, the universal threat of someone used to power without resistance. That evening, I noticed her curtains twitching. She was watching. Measuring. Calculating. The vines, meanwhile, didn't care. They climbed steadily, respecting the fence line but rising higher each day, thickening, weaving themselves into a living wall. Birds began nesting. Bees returned. The space felt alive again. By the end of the week, the first tendrils brushed her exterior wall. Not over the fence. Not trespassing. Just touching the side of her house where it sat close to the property line. Legal. Natural. Documented. I took photos, noting distances and angles, time-stamped and archived. Karen sent her first official violation notice that Friday. It accused me of hostile landscaping. I laughed out loud. The bylaws didn't even have language for that. I responded politely, attaching highlighted sections, species documentation, and photos showing full compliance. I CC'd the entire HOA board. The silence that followed was delicious. Neighbors began stopping by more often, pretending to admire the garden while really enjoying the slow-motion showdown. One whispered, "She hates those vines." Another said, "About time someone beat her at her own game." Support grew quietly, like roots underground. Karen, however, escalated. She started parking her car inches from the fence, inspecting the vines daily, snapping photos, muttering into her phone. The more she fixated, the more the vines flourished, stretching upward, outward, inevitable. Control was slipping, replaced by something she couldn't find or poison. And that terrified her. Because plants don't argue. They just grow. Karen's next move came disguised as concern. On Thursday morning, an HOA inspection team arrived. 2 board members I'd never seen before, both wearing forced smiles and carrying tablets. Karen hovered behind them like a director watching her actors perform. I greeted them politely, offered water, and invited them to inspect whatever they liked. Confidence unsettles bullies more than anger ever could. They walked the fence line slowly, photographing the vines, measuring distances, murmuring to each other. Karen interrupted constantly, pointing at thorns, gesturing at shadows, complaining about potential damage and safety hazards. I waited. When they finished, I handed over a printed packet: bylaws, city ordinances, native plant certifications, planting diagrams, and a timeline starting with the poisoning of my garden. The board members exchanged looks. Karen stiffened. "This isn't relevant," she snapped. "It's the entire context," one board member replied carefully. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. Authority fractured. Karen's voice rose, sharp and defensive, while the others grew quieter, more deliberate. They asked questions she couldn't answer. About warnings. About contractor authorization. About why my garden had been treated without consent. Karen deflected, blamed procedure, cited urgency. None of it sounded convincing when spoken aloud. The inspection ended without a citation. Karen watched them leave, jaw clenched, eyes burning. I knew that look. It wasn't anger anymore. It was panic. That weekend, the vines surged. Warm weather and steady watering accelerated growth, and by Sunday afternoon, her once sunny side yard sat in dappled shade. Thorns traced delicate, threatening patterns against her stucco wall. Still legal. Still compliant. Still unstoppable. She retaliated that night by blasting floodlights toward my yard, claiming security concerns. I checked the ordinances. Light trespass was regulated. I documented glare angles, brightness levels, and duration. Monday morning, I filed a formal complaint. By Tuesday, she was ordered to adjust the lights. Her frustration became spectacle. She yelled at contractors. She argued with neighbors. She posted increasingly unhinged messages on the HOA forum about plant-based harassment. Screenshots circulated. Sympathy evaporated. Meanwhile, my garden rebounded. New leaves unfurled. Pollinators returned in force. The contrast was poetic, life flourishing where it had been poisoned, discomfort spreading where control once reigned. Neighbors stopped whispering and started speaking openly. Support became visible, vocal, impossible to ignore. Karen tried one last tactic: emergency pruning authorization. Denied. The plants were mine. The fence line was respected. The rules were clear. As the vines climbed higher, so did the lesson. You can't dominate nature with paperwork. You can't bully growth into retreat. And when you weaponize rules, you invite someone to read them better than you ever did. Karen had started a fight with chemicals. She was losing it to patience, paper, and thorns. By the following week, Karen's house no longer looked like the spotless model home she prided herself on. The vines had matured rapidly, thickening into a dense lattice of green armor along the shared boundary. Thorns caught sunlight like tiny blades, and shadows crawled across her walls throughout the day. Still, nothing crossed the fence. Still, everything remained compliant. The law was on my side, and it was suffocating her. She stopped pretending to be professional. One morning, I caught her yanking at a vine through the fence, gloves hastily pulled on, face twisted with frustration. She froze when she saw me watching. I calmly reminded her that touching my plants without permission constituted trespass and property damage. She dropped the vine like it burned her and stormed inside without a word. I documented the interaction immediately. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel. Karen was demanding removal of the vines due to property devaluation concerns. I smiled while reading it. Property values were her favorite weapon. Unfortunately for her, native landscaping initiatives were actively encouraged by the city, and several recent studies supported their positive impact. I replied with citations, permits, and photographs. I also included evidence of the chemical poisoning that started everything. The response came faster this time. The HOA board scheduled a formal hearing. The room was packed. Neighbors filled every chair, whispering, watching, waiting. Karen sat stiffly at the front, arms crossed, jaw clenched. When she spoke, her voice trembled with forced authority. She painted herself as a victim of harassment, claimed I was intentionally creating discomfort, insisted the vines were retaliatory. When it was my turn, I spoke quietly. I showed photos of my garden before the poisoning. After. I read the notice she'd posted. I played video of her contractor spraying chemicals. The room shifted. Faces hardened. Murmurs rippled. I then explained the vines. Species. Placement. Compliance. Purpose. Everything documented. Everything legal. The board asked questions. Karen interrupted. They asked her to stop. That alone felt like victory. After a brief recess, the decision was announced. The HOA would take no action against my landscaping. Furthermore, they would review procedures regarding chemical treatments and unauthorized enforcement actions. Karen's face drained of color. Outside, neighbors clapped quietly. One squeezed my shoulder. Another thanked me. The vines rustled in the breeze behind us, alive and indifferent. Karen avoided my eyes as she left, shoulders tight, steps quick. The power she once wielded so casually was gone. Not stripped violently, but eroded. Slowly. Legally. Naturally. And the vines? They were only halfway grown. Karen's retreat didn't bring peace, it brought quiet pressure. The vines kept climbing, and with them, attention. Reporters called after a neighbor posted photos online, careful to blur addresses. I declined interviews, choosing steadiness over spectacle. Still, a camera truck idled once, then left. The story didn't need me, the evidence spoke. Maintenance crews arrived at Karen's house repeatedly, measuring shade, scraping scratches, repainting sections where thorns brushed stucco. Each visit ended with frustration. The plants were mine. The fence line was respected. The city inspector confirmed it again, in writing. Copies went into my binder. Karen tried charm next. She knocked one evening, voice soft, eyes practiced. She apologized without naming harm, suggested compromise without specifics, offered to help replant. I listened, thanked her, and asked for written acknowledgement of the poisoning and reimbursement for losses. Her smile vanished. She left without another word. The garden, meanwhile, thrived. Tomatoes returned, basil stood upright, soil darkened with life. Bees danced. Children walking dogs stopped to watch ladybugs gather. Life has a way of recruiting witnesses. Another HOA notice arrived, thinner than before, requesting mediation. I agreed. Mediation favors preparation. At the session, Karen brought emotion. I brought records. Dates, photos, permits, emails, receipts, ordinances. When she claimed harassment, the mediator asked intent. I explained restoration and compliance. When she claimed danger, the mediator asked boundaries. I showed measurements. When she claimed loss, the mediator asked cause. I played the spraying video. The recommendation was simple: cease interference, reimburse damages, and update HOA procedures. Non-binding, but persuasive. The board accepted it. Karen did not. Acceptance wasn't required for consequences to land. Weeks passed. The vines reached maturity, a living lattice that softened noise and filtered light. Karen installed screens, then removed them. She avoided the side yard entirely. The house felt smaller to her. Control shrank. One morning, I found a note taped to my gate. No threats. No bluster. Just a request to talk again. I removed it, photographed it, and filed it. Some conversations are finished. What remained was balance. My land healed. The rules clarified. Neighbors learned they could question power. And the vines, thorny and native, did what they were meant to do: protect soil, draw life, and remind anyone watching that growth answers poison with patience. I rebuilt the windbreaks, shared seedlings, and taught neighbors how to document interactions. Small skills spread quickly. Fear loosened. Meetings became calmer. Enforcement grew transparent. Karen's shadow receded as sunlight returned to shared spaces. Accountability doesn't roar, it persists. I kept watering, pruning, and recording, choosing consistency over triumph. Justice arrived quietly, measurable in healthier soil, clearer rules, and a community learning to stand without permission. Together we changed expectations, habits, and futures through patience, evidence, and care for all. Karen's influence didn't disappear overnight, but it fractured in visible ways. HOA meetings that once felt like trials transformed into discussions. People raised hands. Asked for clarification. Requested written explanations. The bylaws, once wielded like weapons, were now treated like tools that required care. I attended quietly, speaking only when facts were needed, letting the shift happen without pushing it. Karen still showed up, of course. She sat rigidly, arms crossed, eyes darting whenever landscaping appeared on the agenda. The vines had become symbolic. Not just of defiance, but of limits. Everyone knew the story now, and every new rule proposal was weighed against it. No one wanted another scandal. Transparency became the new priority. Outside meetings, life settled into a steady rhythm. I pruned the vines carefully, guiding growth upward, away from shared sightlines while maintaining the dense barrier along the boundary. They rewarded attention with flowers, subtle but persistent, drawing pollinators in waves. The side of Karen's house remained shaded, cooler in summer, quieter too. She rarely used that yard anymore. One afternoon, I noticed a city truck parked near her driveway. An inspector walked the perimeter with a clipboard, taking notes, snapping photos. Later, a notice appeared on her door: exterior maintenance required where landscaping had caused cosmetic damage. Not my vines, her neglect. Irony has a way of circling back. Karen confronted me again, this time without theatrics. Her voice was flat, tired. She asked if I would consider trimming more aggressively. I explained I already followed best practices and would continue to do so. I offered a copy of the maintenance plan. She declined. Control was no longer the goal. Escape was. Neighbors started planting too. Native hedges. Pollinator gardens. Trellises. The neighborhood softened, greened, diversified. What once looked uniform now looked alive. The HOA adapted, publishing clearer guidelines and banning chemical treatments without consent. The board cited recent events as justification. No names were needed. I shared seeds and advice, careful to keep boundaries respected. Documentation remained routine, not paranoia practice. Once burned, you learn where the water is. Karen listed her house in late summer. The sign went up quietly. No farewell posts. No final notices. Showings happened during the week when most people were working. I wished her no ill. Lessons don't require bitterness to stick. On moving day, a truck idled while workers avoided the shaded side yard entirely. I watched from my garden, hands in soil, the vines rustling softly. When the truck pulled away, the house felt lighter, as if tension had been packed and hauled off with the boxes. What remained was growth. Not just in leaves and stems, but in confidence. The rules hadn't changed me. I'd learned them, respected them, and used them to protect what mattered. The garden thrived. The boundary held. And the lesson rooted deep: poison reveals character, but patience builds power. The weeks after Karen moved out felt strangely calm, like the air after a storm finally settles. The new owners arrived quietly, a couple with 2 kids and a curious golden retriever. They waved on the first day, introduced themselves, and asked about the vines with genuine interest instead of suspicion. I explained the species, the maintenance plan, and the boundary rules. They nodded, relieved, grateful for shade and privacy. Conflict evaporates quickly when control leaves the equation. The HOA continued its transformation. Meetings shortened. Agenda simplified. Chemical enforcement policies were formally revised, requiring written consent, advance notice, and photographic justification. A community garden committee formed. I declined the chair position but helped draft guidelines. Influence, I'd learned, didn't require a title. My own garden reached a kind of maturity too. The soil, once burned, now held moisture and life. Tomatoes climbed strong. Herbs thickened. I harvested enough to share, leaving baskets by neighbors' doors. Food softens defenses faster than arguments ever could. Conversations shifted from complaints to compost, from fines to fertilizer. Occasionally, someone would ask about Karen, lowering their voice as if speaking her name might summon trouble. I kept answers brief. People don't need villains to grow, they need examples. The vines became that example: thorny, yes, but native, lawful, and carefully tended. Protection without aggression. Boundaries without hostility. One afternoon, a city horticulturist stopped by after noticing the pollinator traffic from the street. We talked about native corridors, erosion control, and microhabitats. She asked permission to photograph the boundary as a positive case study. I agreed, amused at how far the story had traveled from poisoned basil to municipal best practices. The new neighbors invited me over for dinner. Their kids asked why the vines had thorns. I told them thorns help plants protect what they need to survive. They nodded, satisfied. Simple truths land best when spoken plainly. At dusk, I walked the fence line, checking ties, trimming lightly where necessary, guiding growth upward. The vines responded as they always had, quietly. Somewhere nearby, laughter carried. Bees settled. The garden hummed with ordinary life, restored and resilient. I thought about the morning I smelled chemicals instead of soil and how anger had nearly driven my next move. Choosing patience hadn't been easy. It had been deliberate. But patience multiplied options, turned rules into shields, and transformed isolation into community. Power had tried to poison growth. Growth answered by rooting deeper. The vines weren't revenge. They were a reminder that lawful resistance, documented and patient, can outlast authority built on fear. And when the dust settles, what remains isn't triumph, it's balance, shared ground, and the quiet confidence of knowing you protected what mattered without becoming what hurt you. Months later, when the vines were fully woven and the garden settled into a steady rhythm, I finally understood what the conflict had really taught me. It wasn't about beating an HOA president or proving a point. It was about learning how power actually works when stripped of noise. Power doesn't shout. It documents. It waits. And when it moves, it does so within the rules that were meant to control it. The garden had become more than food. It was evidence. Evidence that poison can be undone, that soil remembers care, and that patience leaves a longer mark than anger ever could. Each harvest felt like closure. Each basket shared reinforced a community that now spoke to one another instead of reporting each other. The HOA, once feared, had become procedural. Transparent agendas. Recorded decisions. Written warnings before action. The changes were quiet but permanent. No single hero moment, no applause, just systems adjusted to prevent abuse. That mattered more than any apology. Karen's house sold again within the year. The new owners kept the vines, trimmed carefully, grateful for the privacy and shade. No one mentioned her name anymore. Influence fades when it isn't fed. Sometimes, standing in the garden at dawn, I traced the path from that first burned leaf to the living wall now guarding the boundary. I thought about how easily the story could have ended differently with shouting, lawsuits, bitterness. Choosing restraint didn't make me weak. It made me precise. The thorns still caught the light in the afternoon, subtle warnings to anyone who mistook boundaries for invitations. But they also held flowers, small and persistent, drawing bees that stitched the air with purpose. Protection and generosity, side by side. Neighbors stopped by for advice. Not just about plants, but about documentation, consent, and standing firm without escalating. I shared what I knew. Knowledge spreads faster than fear. One evening, the kids next door ran along the fence, counting flowers, laughing. The dog slept in the shade. The vines rustled softly, alive and unbothered. The space felt earned. If there's a lesson here, it's simple. When someone poisons what you love, you don't have to poison back. You can restore. You can prepare. You can read the rules better than they ever did. And you can grow something that protects you without crossing a line. I never confronted Karen again. I didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. My garden thrived. The community healed. The rules learned their place. And every time I harvest basil now, the scent is clean, green, and sharp with memory. Not of anger but of resolve. Because the strongest response to control isn't chaos. It's growth, carefully tended, impossible to ignore, and rooted so deeply that no poison can take it away.